Hello and happy Monday. Welcome to a wonderful gardening week. I see that we've got Dan already here, and I'm hoping that the rest of you will start chatting it up, letting us know what you're thinking about as far as gardening is concerned. My plan today is to talk a little bit about my gardening weekend, my gardening week ahead, and then we can talk about your gardening week. I'll be talking about some topics I think are appropriate for this time of year, and then getting to your questions. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. We've got Wayne that's joined us, so good morning to you. For those of you that are just stumbling upon this spot or don't really know what you're looking at, if you're looking at this in replay, I'm GardenerScott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. And so the intent today is to fulfill that, for you to become a better gardener. So please ask questions as we proceed, and I'll devote as much time as I can today to answer your questions. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the great gardening weekend that I had. On Saturday, I actually taught a class on how to start seeds. Now, this is an important time of year for all of us. I'm in zone 5B in Colorado. So for me, we are just now starting our seeds, the indoor seeds, because it's much too cold to start our seeds outside. I know there's probably a lot of you and a lot of the other gardening channels out there where the seeds are already in the ground in some cases, and they're just starting indoors in other cases. So we're a little bit behind. And welcome to A Soaper's Life. Good to see you this morning. And I see the chicken wire has joined us. Game Nerd Mom, thank you so much. I do try to stay calm and I do try to stay as informative as possible. And so a little bit about the Saturday class of seeds that I had. And hi, Jeff. Hi, Game Nerd Mom again. And Tammy, welcome. This is wonderful to see people starting. So I had about 50 people at this class that I had on Saturday, and most people had already started their seeds at some point in the past. So these were not brand new people trying to learn how to start seeds. And hi, Melissa. Hi, I don't know how to pronounce your name, from Iceland, but welcome. You still have snow and frost. I still have snow and frost as well. And that's why I'm starting by talking about the seeds in particular. And traveling through, I'm going to be doing this every week at the same time, so maybe you'll be first next week, okay? Garden Down South, Mary from Vermont, this is wonderful. So I'll try to keep my focus back and forth between the comments coming in, and I really do want to try to get some information. So back to the idea about the seeds. For many people who have tried seeds, oh, Jay Wells, a super chat. I will definitely stop for that. Thank you so much. GardenerScott, my husband, and I love your show. Never miss an episode. Thank you so much for doing what you do. Well, thank you, Jay Wells. I love what I'm doing, and it really gets my day, my week, my month, my year going when I see how many people are affected by just some good gardening information. And I started this channel because there's a lot of information out there that isn't that great. And so in my Zone 5B garden, I do things different than a lot of people from other areas. Kingman, Arizona, Tammy, you're in the same basic region of our country, but we do things completely differently. So I've said this before in some of my videos. I don't always try to tell you how to do things. I try to explain how things work in general and tell you why the different methods work. And so back to the seeds as an example. I'm starting my seeds this week for the most part downstairs. And that's why this class I had on Saturday worked out so well, because for us, it's time to start. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to follow my lead, okay? You can follow my suggestions. You can get some ideas about how to start seeds. But when I say that I'm starting seeds in the middle of March, you need to figure out for yourself what the best time is for you. And welcome, Vicky. Welcome, Gary. Good to see you. And I'll use Gary as an example here. Gary Red G1 from North Florida in Zone 8B. Okay, he's already got cherry tomatoes that are 14 to 16 inches tall. I'm just beginning to look at my seed packages to figure out which ones I'm going to start. Because in general, the tomatoes will be started indoors 6 to 8 weeks before you put them outside. Believe it or not, I am close to 3 months before I'm going to be putting a lot of my seeds outside. Just like in Iceland, there's a lot of snow and ice on the ground. I'm at this time of year in my area that it's questionable. Like Soper's Life says, she's also in Colorado and loves to grow tomatoes, okay? Well, in Colorado, our last frost date is May 18th in Colorado Springs, where I'm at, okay? Well, this is March, and so looking ahead, yeah, May 18th is just over 2 months from right now. So I could be starting my tomatoes right now. But that means they're on that upper edge. And so 18-inch tall tomatoes are a little bit tall for me putting outside. So I like to actually put my tomatoes outside the first week of June. And hi, Derek, you're in Colorado as well. That's great. Thanks. And Jen Denton, you've already started the sweet peas, radishes, and lettuce. I'm not going to be starting my peas and radishes and lettuce until the beginning of May. And so the point that I want to bring up as I'm talking about seeds and getting started and whether you've already started, there's some important information, and I'm going to drink some of my tea. And if you're enjoying tea as you're watching as well, let me know. I'm a tea guy, not a coffee guy. But like Wayne is in Parker. Believe it or not, Parker, Colorado, which is about 45 minutes up the road from me, we have completely different conditions. In fact, there's almost 1,000-foot difference. So I'm guessing that you in Parker will be starting your seeds and growing your plants even sooner than I can. And so even though May 18th might be my last frost date, I'm putting my plants outside the 1st of June because there's another factor that comes into play here. And it's the weather, it's the climate, it's the things that you need to think about from your plant's perspective. A couple years ago on May 18th, our last frost date, it was snowing and the ground was pretty much still frozen. So not a good time to put plants in the ground. You need to consider the temperature of your soil. And that's why I aim for that first week of June, because it's an almost guaranteed time that the soil will be warm enough for plants. And Chicken Wire, glad you're enjoying tea. Iced tea from Vicky. I'm actually drinking an organic tea that Helen asks. So that's wonder. And the point I'm trying to make for that the Mrs. Marvel brings up is microclimates. If you're living in an area with a nice climate and it's consistent, and I know I've got a lot of viewers in Zone 8 and Zone 9 where weather just kind of creeps up on you, you have spring, and then spring stays. Well, in my region, we have spring in March, and we have spring in April, and we have spring in May, and we have spring in June. We have a roller coaster of weather activities. Today, my weather is going to be in the high 50s Fahrenheit. On Wednesday, our forecast is 67 degrees for a high. And on Friday, our forecast is 37 degrees for a high. That's a 30-degree difference in 2 days. And so I have an environment that it's extremely difficult to try to figure out exactly when I'm going to put the plants outside. And so I give myself a couple extra weeks. I give myself 2 weeks after that last frost date. And I look for those microclimates. And A Soper's Life, hey, thank you for another super chat. How do I know whether my soil needs calcium? I'll go ahead and answer that right now. Chances are your soil doesn't need calcium. Calcium is very prevalent in most soils in the United States. The best way to find out is to get a soil test done. You're going to be guessing about some of the calcium levels and the other nutrient levels in your soil. Get a soil test. That's the best way to do it. But you can assume that your soil has enough calcium. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth because I do want to answer your question. So I'll get back to microclimates and the growing and seeds and putting them outside. But like Mr. or M Go Blue from Michigan in Zone 6 says, don't put anything outside until Memorial Day. That's the idea, is you need to figure out within your local region what's best for you. And then you can put your plants in the ground. Microclimates, if you can construct an area, and I'll do this in one of these future live chats, where I'll talk about extending your season so that you can create microclimates to start sooner. I'm going to be starting my tomato seeds here pretty soon because I want to get an early start, earlier than my last frost date. And I'll have a video on this. We'll talk more about this in the live chat because I'll be creating a microclimate that will allow my tomatoes to grow. And to get back to Soper's life question, because it does tie into tomatoes. One of most gardeners' big concerns, and the reason that they ask about calcium, is because blossom end rot in tomatoes can be very common. And that's well known as caused by a calcium deficiency. Well, it's not so much that there's a lack of calcium in the soil that's causing blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is most often caused by watering issues. And what I mean by that is too much water or too little water will not enable the roots of the tomato plant to absorb the calcium that's already in the soil. And I'll cover that in tomato-specific videos in the future. But if you've got concern about calcium in your soil, just try to water properly. And that's to keep your soil evenly moist as often as possible. So I'm glad to see this interface back and forth between people who have lived in Colorado, are currently in Colorado, Washington State. This is great. This is why I'm doing this. So I'm so glad to see all the participation on this. And so it's back to starting seeds, back to all those questions I had from my class that I taught on Saturday, and moving forward to this time ahead as far as starting the seeds. You've got to figure out for yourself what time is best. And a lot of the comments that are coming in reflect that. I'm starting this week on peppers and a couple of my tomatoes. I won't be starting the warm season plants like the lettuces and the spinaches for another couple months. That's hard because right now with the weather in the 50s and coming into the 60s, many of us can fall victim to false springs. We think the weather is going to be great, and so we start seeds or we start putting plants outside. And at least here in Colorado, it's easy to get suckered into a complete death in the garden. I've seen this a lot with brand new gardeners. And if you're a brand new gardener, consider this as an important lesson to learn. And thanks, Mac Life. I appreciate it. I am planning on keeping up the great work. If you're new in gardening, if you're new watching my channel, if this is going to be one of the first years that you're gardening, don't look at just the weather to determine whether you're going to be starting your seeds or putting plants outside. And what I mean by that is weather is a short-term event. Today, I've got sunny weather with temperatures in the 50, a little bit of wind, and it's kind of dry. On Friday, my weather is going to be very cold with a chance of snow and also probably some wind. So weather's going to change from day to day. Your climate may stay relatively consistent. You may be dry and hot in the summer. You may be cold and wet in the winter. That's your climate. But if you've got a cold, wet climate for your winter, and then suddenly you have a week of really warm weather like we've had recently, don't get fooled into thinking that your climate is now adjusting to the point that you can start seeds and put plants outside, because the climate is still there. And if you've got a cold, wet climate, just because this week is hot and dry doesn't mean that next week isn't going to get back to the cold and wet conditions. So that's just kind of a suggestion to be careful about what you do. And so life goes on. Thank you for that super chat. Can a hoop house help you move the plant early? Yes, that's exactly my point when I said I'm going to be creating some microclimates so that my plants will be able to go out early. That's exactly the kind of microclimate that I'm talking about. I'll be putting my tomatoes in wall of waters, and I'll be putting the wall of waters inside a hoop house. And so a typical hoop house in a garden, which is a plastic covering over hoops, and you can look back at some of my earlier videos where I talk a little bit about this and show how to make the hoops. And so a hoop house covered in plastic can easily increase the temperature during the day because it kind of acts like a mini greenhouse. It's absorbing the sunlight, it's warming up the air, it's warming up the soil, and then the plastic holds in some of that heat during the night and during cold conditions. And so the soil temperature can be very important for plants growing, especially tomatoes that like warm soil and warm conditions. So a hoop house will raise the temperature during the day, it'll raise the temperature at night, it'll retain some of that soil heat, and yes, you can start plants earlier. I'll be covering that much more in depth in future videos. Chicken wire, 70 degrees last Friday, 20 degrees forecasted this week. Exactly my point. So don't be tempted to get out there and get started. I'll get back to your question, Joyce, about cinnamon and nuts, or gnats, I should say. Central Texas, if you don't like it, just wait a minute. Exactly. I've lived in Texas, and you can walk indoors to have lunch and walk outdoors, and it's like you walked into another planet. Okay? False spring from Cheryl, absolutely. So just be aware, because at this time of year, all of us are chomping at the bit. We want to get outside. We want to do that gardening. And then the weather improves, and we think we can do it. Notice what I just said. The weather changes. Live for what your climate is in the garden and make your plans according to that. I want to talk just a couple minutes right now about the single seed challenge. And this was actually started by Scott Head over at the Black Gumbo Southern Gardening channel. And he put out the challenge to YouTube gardening video creators to pick a seed and track that seed through its entire growth cycle over the course of a year. And I took him up on the challenge, and I'll be starting that here in just a couple days, in picking out the seed, sowing the seed, growing the plant, putting the plant into the garden, and tracking its entire progress over the course of the year. The idea being that if you can focus your attention on one plant that starts from one seed, and you've had complete control over that during the entire growth cycle of that plant, I think this is a great opportunity to learn exactly about what seeds need and about what plants need. And so I'm going to offer you to take this same challenge, not necessarily to make a video and to post a video about the whole process. I'll be doing that. And so you can see how all of those pieces fit together. But for you, as you start your seed indoor when it's appropriate time, or if you sow seeds outside, put a little marker of some type on that seed and on that plant, and give yourself this challenge. Try to learn everything you can about that seed and that plant this year. And it can be any type of plant. It can be a tomato, it can be lettuce, whatever you want to take the time to do. But so many of us have so many questions about gardening. And I see a lot of questions coming up about hoop houses and hardening off and polytunnels and cold hardy plants under a mulch of straw. These are all questions that we have. And I have some of these in earlier videos, and I'll be covering these much more in depth. And I know I can't get to everybody's question today. And so what I'll do is I'll review a lot of these questions. And next week, I'll try to address as many of the questions that I couldn't get to today. And I plan on doing this every Monday. So every Monday, we'll build on the previous week's information. And then we'll look forward to the following week. And that's what I like about this single seed challenge, because if you look at your entire growing season with a focus on a single seed and a single plant, rather than waiting till the end of the season and you try to figure out what went wrong and what are the lessons that I can learn for next year, take it 1 week at a time. And so you've started a seed indoors, and maybe it's doing great, but maybe it's not doing so great. So rather than wait till the end of the year and just say, yeah, I killed all my seeds, let's spend some time analyzing. Why was it your seed didn't do so well this week? And what can we do to change that and learn about it so that it does better next week? And then when that seed gets into the seedling and transplant stage and we put it outside, it's the same idea, okay? I'm focused on this one plant right now. What can I do to make sure this plant survives? And so for that week, you look at the plant, you look at the weather, you look at the water. Is it raining? Do you need to add more water? Has it been dry? Has it been extra cold? Has it been extra hot? What are the conditions that your plant is exposed to, and how has it responded in this week? And then next week you do the same thing. Now, by focusing on one specific plant that you are babying, that you have adopted through this one seed challenge for the entire season, you're going to be amazed, because it's actually going to open your eyes to all of the other plants. So if you're learning about a tomato plant because that's your focus for this season, you're going to realize that pepper plants have similar needs as the tomatoes. And the fertilizing requirements of the tomato are probably going to be similar to the fertilizer requirements of some of the squashes and melons that you're going to be growing. So focus on one plant. Take up this challenge where you're starting something from seed, and then you continue it through its entire process. And for those of you that might be watching from the southern hemisphere, you're getting to the end of your growing season. And so take this seed challenge from the end of your growing season and start thinking in terms of, okay, I grew these plants this year. Now what I'm going to do is actually save some of my seeds so that next year I can not only do the one seed challenge and track it from the beginning to the end, but I know exactly where the seed came from. I know the heirloom tomato that I harvested these seeds from. And now, over the course of your upcoming winter, you learn about seed saving and you learn about seed storage, so that next year, when the rest of us are getting to that point where we're starting to save seed and store seed, you're getting to that point in Australia where you're going to be starting your seed indoor and completing the process. And I think this is a great idea to really learn more about what it takes to grow a plant from seed to harvest, and then to harvesting of the seeds, by just babying and adopting a single plant. So take me up on this challenge and let me know what you think as you proceed, because I really do want to see the rest of your comments as we proceed. And so, yeah, Jeff Davis has a great idea. Maybe target 3 of them and pick which one sprouts and which ones don't, and then start keeping the stats of it. And I did want to bring up that subject about garden journals today, because in a couple of my recent videos, I've talked about the importance of garden journals. It's a little bit easier for me, I'll suggest, in that I do a video documentation of my garden and my plants. It helps me out. Believe it or not, I'm not just doing this for you, I'm doing it for me, because there's stuff that I want to know about my garden. And I'll look back on some of my previous videos to see what the garden looked like and what I learned. But keep a garden journal. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Had a comment just this morning about keeping a garden journal using Word and linking it to the phone. So if you carry your phone in the garden, I think it's a great idea. If you're learning something outside, pull out your phone and just write yourself a note while you're actually in the garden. And if it's an insect that's eating a plant, take a picture of the insect while you're in the garden and then just transfer it over to your electronic garden journal. And then when you've got time, you can look up to find out more about that insect. So document and create data on your garden and all of these things that are working. For my single seed challenge, yes, like your suggestion, I'm actually going to be doing multiple seeds, and I'll be using different media to start them. So one of the seeds that I'll be using my own seed starter mix. And another one, I'll be starting in a peat pellet. And I'll be tracking along the way. And when I get the plants out in my garden, I'm going to be seeing if I can put one in a biochar bed, one that's not in a biochar bed, and see how they grow. So I'm going to be comparing different seeds and different plants as part of this single seed challenge. You certainly don't need to do that. But consider the idea. If you can learn this year all of the steps from starting a seed to harvesting and understanding what each of those steps are and how they work with the other steps, think about how much more you're going to know at the end of this season. And that's why I'm doing this, because I'm hoping at some point to pass the torch to all of you, to give you the opportunity to maybe start a gardening channel and share the knowledge that maybe begins this week with you in your garden. I love your comments, Jeff. Yeah, foster seed parent. That's a great idea. Thanks, Harry. I'm trying to get the good stuff out there, and the videos do help. The Mrs. Marvel, Google Docs, exactly right. If you're gardening with other people in your family, Google Docs is a great idea, excuse me, because you can share the information with other people. Just let them load the information or upload the information on Google Docs. Egocentric homestead, keeping track of everything this year and the development. That's great, but you say you won't be concentrating on one plant from seed to harvest. Well, why not? You're going to be tracking the development of all the plants. Just maybe put a little asterisk next to your tomatoes. And maybe you're not tracking the tomato by individual plant and individual seed, but maybe challenge yourself to learn more about tomatoes this year than you might some of your other plants. So hi, Kim from Montana. Victory Begins in the Garden, it looks like, has just joined us. Serenity Meadow Permaculture, you're very welcome. Mrs. Marvel, again, sounds like what you did to compare and contrast seeds in your raised beds. That's the idea. It's all about the information and moving forward. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about microclimates, and I touched on that briefly. I'll be doing videos here coming up where I talk more about the hoop houses and I talk more about the wall of waters. And I'll be talking more about microclimates. The idea behind a microclimate, the idea behind the hoop houses, is that you are creating a new climate. You are artificially influencing the weather around your plant. So if you live in a very wet region, so wet that, let's say you have clay soil, that you just can't grow much in the spring because your soil is so soggy and sticky, well, you can do a raised bed, and I saw this question earlier, and put hoops in your raised bed, and then cover those hoops with plastic. Well, now the soil in your raised bed is not that sticky clay because you've amended it. You've made it better. And by putting a hoop covered with plastic over a raised bed, you can actually keep the rain out of your bed. So the hoops are not just for keeping plants warm. They can also be used to keep plants drier. Or if you're in a very dry region, if you use a lot of organic matter in your soil and then you use a mulch on top of that, when you water and then cover your hoops with plastic, you're creating an environment that's more humid than the outside air. And so you can actually cut down on the amount of watering that you need by using hoops and using plastic covering to affect the humidity within your garden, not just the heat levels within your garden. And in my region, particularly in April, going into May, it's extremely windy. Well, by covering the plants in your raised bed with hoops and plastic, you can cut down on the wind. I have difficulty growing peppers, particularly sweet peppers. And one of the reasons for that is because of the wind and it drying out the area around the peppers because they do prefer it slightly humid. But if I grow my peppers in a greenhouse or in a hoop house, I have much better success. So consider expanding into something like hoop houses where you are affecting your own microclimates, you're influencing the weather around the plants. And so if you don't know much about that right now, now's the time to start learning. So let's get back to some of the comments. Hello, Susan in West Central Florida. And from Jersey, nice to see you there. 67 degrees today. It sounds great. Ontario, Canada. Move North Homestead. Raised bed gardening, lasagna layers, row covers. That's wonderful. And I'll actually I have a planned video coming up about lasagna gardening. So look forward to that. One of the things that I want to say I feel bad about it, though I know I shouldn't feel bad, is because I'm a couple weeks or maybe even a couple months behind you in my calendar of starting seeds and putting outside. There's a lot of things that I want to show you, but I have to wait until my plants are actually growing in my garden until I can show you what it is I want to show you. And by then, you may already have those plants in your garden and you will have missed out on some of that important information. So I'm up to almost 140 videos, believe it or not. So those of you that are new to the channel, you can look back in my library to the last couple years, and you may be able to find a video that covers the information that you're concerned about right now, but that I haven't covered yet. And as I start making many more videos, they'll go into the library. And my intent is just to create a compilation of great information so that maybe I won't be able to answer your question this year, but hopefully the video I do this year will be available next year. And so you'll be able to start with some good stuff. And the seed starting is a perfect example of that. I've already done a video on lights in starting seeds and how I set up my grow operation, and I did a video on containers and how you get everything together as far as heat mats and your soil media when it comes time to starting seeds, but I haven't started seeds yet. So that video that shows how to actually start seeds is coming up. And if you can handle that little bit of a delay, great for you. But if you've already started, just realize that next year that video is going to be available. Susan Baker planted the first container and raised garden bed in over 25 years. Good for you, Susan. I think that's awesome. If you have a big delay in when you might have had your first start as far as an interest in gardening to when you can actually start gardening, that's wonderful. Just get out there and get to it. Cameras are awesome, or camera straw awesome, whatever that is. I'm sorry that I mispronounced that. 80s during the day and nights are around 45 to 50 degrees. Perfect. Tilt says 50 degrees here today, excited for spring. Both of you highlight on a magic number in gardening, and that magic is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 10 degrees Celsius. That's a critical number. When you want to start putting your warm weather plants outside, like the tomatoes and the peppers, the nighttime temperatures really need to be above 50 degrees. If you haven't created that artificial environment with a hoop house, or if you're not growing in a greenhouse, the plants need 50 degrees at night for the flower development and for the fruit development. So if you fall into that false spring mentality and you start putting your plants out early because you think you can, 50 degrees is the magic number. Make sure the nighttime temperature has reached that point. Now for the cool season plants, the spinach, the beets, the peas, those plants that can handle some frost and handle some cold temperatures, 50 degrees is now an important number to look at as far as the daytime temperatures are concerned. And we're talking about consistent temperatures. So even though I'm close to 60 degrees today, I'll be in the 60s for the next 3 days. Because my Friday temperature is going to drop back into the 30s, it's still a little early for me to start putting some of those cool season plants outside. But if you are consistently in 50 degree Fahrenheit range or 10 degrees Celsius range as your daytime temperatures, then now's the time to start thinking about putting some of those cool season plants in your garden. Start planting some pea seeds, start doing some spinach, start your parsnips, start your beets, start your lettuce. All of those plants can handle temperatures dropping below 50 degrees. But when it's 50 out during the day, they're going to be happy and they're going to do extremely well. Wayne Kerr's got 20 acres with pine trees, and he's got a whole bunch of organic matter, mainly pine needles and pine cones, but he read that they're not good for mulch and compost. That is not true. They are wonderful for compost and mulch. In fact, for my strawberries in particularly, I prefer using a pine needle mulch. I use a lot of pine needles and pine cones in my pathways in the garden. And so a lot of it comes down to where you're using the mulch and how you're using the compost, or I should say how you're building your compost, making the compost. Is a very common misconception. And you'll hear this again because I've got a video coming up in a little bit where I'll give another set of myths of the garden. And in this video coming up, one of the myths is going to be pine needles and whether they acidify the soil, because that's the common misperception. If you take a green pine needle off of a tree and you test its pH, it is going to be acidic. If you take a dry pine needle off of the ground and test its pH, you will notice a dramatic change in the pH of that pine needle. In fact, it's going to be pretty close to neutral. And by the time that that pine needle and pine cone has decomposed into the soil, it has zero impact on changing the pH of the soil. Instead, it has decomposed and added some really good organic material to the soil. And the one reason that I really like using leaves and pine needles as mulches in my garden, because the trees are absorbing a lot of minerals from the soil as they grow. And those minerals gradually find their way into the leaves and the pine needles. So if you use those as mulch, when it decomposes, it releases those minerals back into the soil. And there's a lot of things that we compost. A lot of our vegetable garden waste that goes into the compost is great for adding a lot of the things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and many other nutrients. But they're not so good at adding minerals to the compost. So by putting leaves and pine needles into your compost pile, you're actually introducing a great source of minerals. Now, the reason I say it depends on how you make your compost, because the pine needles and the pine cones take a long time to decompose. So if you're trying to make some quick compost using a hot compost method where in a month you're adding it to your soil again, the pine needles and the pine cones might not be best to add. But if you're taking a long, slow approach, yeah, definitely use those as a compost. Definitely consider adding them as a mulch in your garden. So Hilt Tilt, thanks. I appreciate you with the videos, and I'm glad I can help you as a newbie gardener. I know I've had a lot of newbies that have said thank you. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you listening. And I really appreciate a lot of those old seasoned gardeners that comment and say they've been gardening for a long time and they learned something. And believe it or not, I watch a lot of gardening videos and I read gardening blogs, and I am always buying more gardening books, because even though I've been doing this seriously for about 15 years now, I went through the Master Gardener training back in 2004. Even though I taught a class on Saturday, and I'll be teaching a class in a couple weeks at one of our local nurseries on soil, I'm doing these videos for you. So you have the assumption possibly that I know everything I need to know for my garden. Well, that's not true. Every time I teach a class and someone asks a question that makes me think a little bit, and every time I watch a video, and every time I read a book or a blog, I learn something new. It might be just a little thing, but it's enough to get me thinking about how I garden. It may be whether I should modify something, change something, and in my 5B garden, I'm doing things different than those of you in Texas or Florida in a zone 8 or a zone 9. But the way we do things are really quite similar. So even if I'm sitting amongst the snow in my garden like I have in recent videos, if you're watching from one of those warm regions, yes, I certainly appreciate you watching, because I know you can glean some information, even though we're in completely different regions. So, okay, so Heidi says, did not know that the acidity is not there when the pine needles are dry. And there's, let me throw out another nice little tidbit of information. If you run a pH test on rainwater, you will find that rainwater is quite acidic. But does anybody complain that they need to stop the rain from watering their garden because they're worried about the rain causing their soil to become more acidic? Not at all. Once the rainwater, the pine needles, everything else that we're putting into the soil, once it gets into the soil and all those microorganisms start working at it, by the time it's fully decomposed, it's been completely buffered, moderated. The soil level is actually much closer to a neutral pH. So if you've got acidic soil or you've got an alkaline soil, one of the best ways to buffer that pH is to add organic material to your soil, because as it breaks down, your entire soil will get closer to a neutral pH. Okay, so Lorenzo llamas, that's great. Are you raising llamas? That would be awesome. And actually, I've got a person near me that raises llamas, and so I'll be talking about llama manure in future videos as well. But you say your husband and you are on your second year, and the videos have been a huge help. Great. Thanks for the heart. I appreciate that. Victory begins in the garden. Plant an experimental garden bed. I'm definitely going to be doing experimental garden beds. One of the other wonderful things that happened to me this weekend was yesterday. I went and bought a load of lumber. And so today, after I'm done with this, I'm going to go out and build some more garden beds. I've got the beds that you've probably already seen in the videos. They're the same beds that have been there a while because it's been so cold I haven't been able to get outside. But this warm weather is enabling me this week to get outside and build some more beds. And I'll be bringing in some more soil, and I'll be expanding in the next couple weeks. And so because I'm already going to be doubling the beds that I've got in just the next couple weeks, I'm going to be doing a lot of experimental beds, and I'll be sharing the results with you. If you saw my unboxing seeds video, I pointed out in that video that I ordered seeds from different companies, the same type of variety. And so that's just one of the kind of experiments I'm going to be doing, is comparing the results of seeds from different companies to see if there's a difference. And then I'll also be comparing how the different plants do in different types of soils. So look for that. That's a great idea. I think everybody should have an experimental bed, because that's half the fun, is just trying new things. So the overworked gardener has clay soil. So I wish something would add acidity to your soul. Well, to add acidity to the garden and to the soil, you can add sulfur. As to your soul, I guess you could draw a correlation to the devil and the sulfur down in the regions below, adding something to your soul that's acidic. How's that? A little bit of philosophy for the day. Okay, watching from South Alabama. That's great. An egocentric homestead. Gardening is an experiment, a lifelong experiment. Exactly. And that gets back to my point of why I continue to watch videos and read and learn, because it is an experiment. And there's all these other factors, all these variables that impact what the end result is. And the end result is usually not repeatable. In science, you come up with your hypothesis, you develop your tests and your experiments, you come up with whatever the outcome is, and for it to be good science, it should be repeatable. Well, I think we all know, even the newbies that are just starting out, you can do everything the same way in your second year of gardening, and it's not going to be exactly the same as the previous year. The weather's going to be different. The water's going to be different. There's going to be different amounts of sun. There might be different insects. There might be differences in how much time you put into your garden. So the entire experience is experimental. Know that going into it. Know that it's just a big experiment, and you're putting yourself into it as a huge variable. And as you learn more, hopefully it becomes much more of a positive variable. So consider that you are the most important factor in your garden. Soil is key. The water, the sun, all of the rest of it, the nutrients, the compost, the mulch, those are all important. But you are the single biggest variable. And so your improving knowledge will definitely make it better. Okay, life from ashes. Every season comes with its own challenges, definitely. Let's go to Sweden. Grow Herbal Life. That's wonderful. Thanks for joining us from clear across the pond. Jason in Missouri, Zone 6B. Yeah, you're a couple weeks ahead of me. Now, I see a question up above about one of my videos. You say 45% mineral. I don't know what that is. Would you please explain? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that right now because my video, I think it's a week from Friday, the video is going to be about soil. It's going to be understanding soil. And I'll be going much more in depth about that concept of 45% mineral content of soil. And even the concept of just 5% of your soil should be organic. 25% water, 25% air. A lot of those ratios just don't make sense. So come back a week from Friday, check out my video, and I'll cover that much more in depth. So Monica's asking about English lavender. And the same source said that lavender is a perennial in some areas and an annual in other areas. And so thanks for pointing out the zone 6, as I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, and I'm in zone 5, okay? When you look at lavenders in particular, take time to note the zone that the lavender is intended for, because most lavenders will say zone 6 and zone 7. If you can create an area that's close to zone 6, you should be able to grow most lavenders. But you might have one of those types that requires a zone 7. I've had some pretty good success growing Munstead lavender here in my zone 5 area. But what I've done is I've mulched heavily with gravel near where I plant the lavender. And I usually put it at the edge of a bed, and then the edging for that bed, I'll use brick. And then within that bed, I'll put some nice big boulders. And the reason I do that is because I'm creating a microclimate specifically for my lavender. The gravel, the brick, and the rocks absorb the sun's heat during the day, and then they'll release that heat at night. And so areas that are rocky with a rock mulch or those rocks tend to have a higher soil temperature than areas around it. And so for my lavender, I'm attempting to create an environment that is much closer to zone 6 than to my zone 5. And I've been pretty lucky with that. Now, it is possible that if you get some really serious cold weather during the winter, that it could get cold enough to kill the lavender plants. But if you've got the right environment with a microclimate, or you buy a lavender that matches up with your zone, and depending on the source, the lavender Munstead variety is good for zone 5. Even though most of the sources say zone 6, you can get by with growing lavender. But do treat it as an annual. If you're in Michigan or Minnesota in a zone 4 or maybe a zone 5A, yes, your lavender may very well end up being an annual just because your winters are so harsh the plants can't survive. If you're in one of those regions where you're right on the edge and you want to try to grow lavender, I'll show some of this in future videos, but the idea is that you protect that plant. You can actually put a dome over that plant in the winter. Because the plant will go dormant, you can cover it with a very large pot. You don't have to worry about photosynthesis. That pot is keeping the sun out, but it might actually create a microclimate around the plant so that the pot heats up. And I'm thinking in terms of like a a terracotta or clay pot. So the pot is absorbing some of the heat during the day, staying warm, even when it's cold and snowy outside. And that might be enough to turn your perennial lavender, or turn your annual lavender into a perennial. Okay, let's get back to Zone 5A lavender is not a perennial here, exactly. But with protection, it might work. Wayne Kerr planted raspberries last year, and all you have is a stick in the ground. How do I tell if it's still alive? You can actually go out, and this time of year is a good way to tell. If you just take your thumb and just scrape away at the bark a little bit, you might be able to tell if it's still alive. But I have to ask you the question, do you know what kind of raspberry you planted? Because there are two basic types of raspberries. There's the summer bearing and there's the fall bearing. And I grow the fall bearing raspberries. And so what happens in the fall, after they have flowered and fruited and I've harvested, the cane dies. And so it will not come back the next year. And so I can cut my raspberry canes back down to the ground every year. So the thumbnail test doesn't necessarily work for that. But if you've got a summer bearing raspberry, it will live 2 years basically. And so you'll get the plant that's growing over the winter, and then the cane actually stays viable. And in the spring, it will continue growing and give you your early flowers and your fruit in the summer. And then you'll chop it down at the end of the fall because it's already produced its fruit. So depending on the type of raspberry you have, you can just flick your thumbnail to see if it's alive right now. Other than that, just wait a few weeks, because raspberries can actually grow when it's cold and snowy outside. And so pull back any mulch that you might have, and don't be surprised if you don't see leaves starting to pop up pretty soon around the base of that plant. Russell Bublet says, elderberries are hard to root. It's out of my reach right now, but I actually have some elderberry cuttings right now that I'm attempting to root. In the past, in 1 year, I had, I think, 15 cuttings. And from those 15 cuttings, I think I got 3 or 4 that rooted and developed into plants. So yes, they can be quite difficult. I tried last year, towards the beginning of the year, and tried 10 elderberry cuttings, started filming the whole process, was going to show you how easy it is to root elderberries if you do it right, and I didn't get a single one of those 10 to root. So yes, it can be extremely difficult even when you know what you're doing. The only thing I can say is just keep trying it. And if I get success with this newest batch, then I'll release the video and I'll show you everything that I do with that. Let's go on now to Heidi Clark. Try growing lavender in a container so you can bring it in. Great idea. If you're in that zone 5 or colder and you want to grow lavender, grow it in a pot. It can actually grow pretty well in a pot. And then you bring it into a shed or a garage, a cool area during the winter, but an area that doesn't freeze solid. And you can probably get your lavender to have some success. And with the lavender growing in a pot or a big container of some type, you can move it all around and really add some good color to your landscape. So I think that's a great idea. Let's go on now. David De Giusti, your soil is 100% compost. Should I add sulfur to grow potatoes? A lot of it depends on the compost. Compost should be pretty close to neutral, and you shouldn't have to add sulfur for potatoes. What I would suggest adding is some type of mineral component. I like to, and I've said this before, I think a soil should contain minerals. It should contain some actual native soil from your garden space. And then to that, you can add a lot of compost. But by trying to grow 100% in compost, the potatoes will grow, but you might not necessarily be giving the plants all the nutrients that it needs. Now, in the past, I've grown in potato towers. And the way I do that is I'll put a layer of straw and a layer of compost and a layer of straw and a layer of compost and a layer of straw and a layer of compost. And essentially, I'm growing in 100% compost. And I've never added sulfur. The plants have done great. The potatoes have done great. But at least in my case, in those conditions where it was essentially 100% compost for the potatoes, they didn't grow as big as I've grown them in a soil mix. And the plants were not as big. They yellowed a little bit early than the potatoes that were growing in a soil mix. I'm hesitant to suggest adding sulfur or anything that will dramatically change the pH without knowing what your starting pH is. So get yourself a simple test, one of those little pH tests where you can get some little strips, test the pH of your compost, see how it is, and then that might help you determine whether you need to add sulfur to it or not. Laura says, I have some year-old seed starting mix. Should I sterilize that in the oven before planting seedlings in it? This is one of those things that if you do it, you probably will only do it once. Because if you put soil of any type in your oven and attempt to sterilize it that way, it can create quite a stench throughout your house that can linger for a few days. So I don't usually recommend that you use the oven to sterilize your seed starting mix or potting mix. One option, and you may have seen this on some other channels as well, is to take boiling water. And so put your mix into a bowl or some container and pour boiling water over it. And that boiling water should be enough to sterilize it. Now, if you've been storing your mix in containers or bags where they would not have been contaminated with anything, then you could reuse it without sterilization. I do that all the time. But if you're at all concerned about insect eggs or fungi or bacteria that might have somehow infected your mix, then I would say just go ahead and take some boiling water. It's easy, it won't smell up your house, and it should do the trick. So Lorenzo again asks, have I ever had spider mite issues? If so, what do you recommend to prevent or treat them? Yes, I think almost all gardeners at some time are going to have spider mite issues. One of the easiest ways to deal with those is to increase air circulation. If you can have some really good air circulation around your plants, it's going to dramatically reduce your spider mite issue. You can use neem oil, that can be effective. You can actually just get down to the individual plants and take a wet cloth and try to rub off as many of the spider mites, reduce their population, and then do all the other factors. So maybe a little bit of neem oil, maybe some manual control, some improved air circulation. Don't allow the mulch that you're using in that particular area to get sopping wet, and that should help reduce the spider mites a little bit better. Pete and Cat's RV Life says our elderberry didn't come up. It said to pour boiling water over them first on the elderberry. I've never heard of that. I suppose someone somewhere may have thought they had some type of fungus in the soil and boiling water would have killed the fungus and that fungus was what was affecting the elderberry. But I've never heard that. Boiling water is enough to kill plants, and that's one of the organic methods for killing weeds is to pour boiling water on weeds because that boiling water could kill plants. So I'm not aware of any research that has shown that pouring boiling water over a plant that you want to grow is going to be successful. So it's possible that elderberry will come back, give it a little bit of time. But yeah, on the surface, I might suggest that could have been a mistake. I'll look into that. I'll spend some time this week and see if I can find anything about boiling water on live plants and if that can add any benefit at all. But no, that's something new for me. See, you learn something all the time. Even I learn new stuff. I'm definitely gonna have to check that out. Heidi mentions that she's heard that spider mites do not like cold water, so if you spray cold water on them, and that kind of gets down to my point where you use a wet cloth to do the same thing. Most spider mite problems tend to be indoors, and so I've also seen that cold water can be effective from some people. I think that's more effective outside. I don't know that it's as effective inside because our room temperatures tend to stay warm and you're going to have a hard time reaching all of the spider mites. But sure, add it to the list of things to try. A lot of times one thing by itself won't work, but if you try a couple things together and mix them up, that combination might work. Scotty asks, should you have a fan on your pepper and tomato starts the whole time or just when they get to a certain height? Great question. And I actually just bought a little fan to put on my seedlings, specifically the peppers and the tomatoes as they start here in a few weeks. There's a couple reasons for why you want to use fans with your seedlings. One being that if you can get that air circulation, just like we were talking about with the spider mites, if you can get some really good air circulation on your seedlings, it's going to cut down on fungal problems, bacterial problems, and insect problems like fungus gnats and the spider mites. And so I told you we would get to the fungus gnats issue. And so this is the issue that I want to start talking about. Fans and the moisture level at the surface of your soil are the biggest factors when it comes to fungus gnats and even things like spider mites. So by adding a fan to your grow area where you have your seedlings, it should reduce some of those problems. Fungus gnats, the name says it. They like an area where fungus will grow, and fungus will grow in an area that is wet, consistently moist. And we want our seedlings primarily to be consistently moist. So it is an area ripe for fungal gnats. So allow the surface of your pots or trays to dry out a little bit, and that should reduce that problem a lot. And then that gives you the opportunity to just continue watering from the bottom. And I'll be showing that in that video, seed starting video that's coming up. So you put a fan in place to improve air circulation. You water from below, and that should decrease the risk of fungus gnats in your seed growing operation. Now, if you've got fungus gnats in an area like with your house plants, the same thing holds true. I wouldn't necessarily put a fan in place, but you need to make sure that you've got a lot of air circulating around the stems of your plants and keep the soil surface as dry as possible. Back to the question about the peppers and the tomatoes and whether the fans are appropriate for certain growth stages. Once you got the air circulation, the plants are growing nice and strong. Now the recommendation becomes you put a fan in place because you're essentially simulating outdoor situation where the plants are going to be exposed to wind. And when plants are exposed to wind, not just tomatoes and peppers, they tend to develop a sturdier and stronger stem or stalk. So by putting a fan, like an oscillating fan that goes back and forth across your tomatoes and your peppers, yes, it can give you a stronger, sturdier plant. You can also just take your hand, and I do this often, particularly when at the school when I was growing thousands of plants and I couldn't put a fan to cover all those. I would just take my hand and I would just rub my hand lightly across the top of the plants to give them that little bit of resistance and not necessarily force them, but encourage them to grow stronger. So when the tomatoes and the peppers are at about I'd say you could start this when they're about 3 inches tall. By the time they get to about 6 or 8 inches tall, their stem is going to be developed to the point that a fan or rubbing your hand across it is not going to have as big an impact. So yeah, definitely use a fan. That's what I'm going to do with my seedlings when they're young to help develop that stronger plant as it continues to grow. And Jesse says they strengthen them. Yes, absolutely. Life from ashes. Fans help leggy plants. If you can get it early enough, yes. Leggy plants, like really long leggy plants that maybe you've tried to grow on a windowsill and you didn't have enough light, at some point they're unrecoverable. Even if you put a fan on them, the initial growth pattern of that plant was just too thin and it won't grow into that sturdy plant that you want. So legginess, like when the plant is in that 2 to 3 inch stage, and recognize it. Look at the distance between those first 2 leaves, the cotyledon leaves and the true leaves. And then look to see how quickly the next set of leaves develop. And if there's a lengthening of the stem before the next set of true leaves develop, that's your first indication that the plant is getting leggy. It's putting its growth into the stem to reach the light. It's not putting its growth into new leaves. So if you can catch it at that point, then yes, the fans can definitely help improve the leggy plant from continuing to be leggy. But more importantly, you should lower the level of your lights. Lower them closer to where the plant is so that they're getting stronger light. Okay, so let's get back to some more questions. I programmed to give you about an hour to an hour and a half, and we're already at about the 82-minute point. So I'll try to answer as many questions as I can from this point. Craig says, hey, GardenerScott, the boiling water comments were with regards to the seeds. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I missed that. I noticed that some of the comments aren't showing up as they are ordered, okay? Realize that a seed is alive, okay? Even when it's dormant, it's actually living. If it's in your refrigerator, there's actually a piece of that seed that's alive. And so there are some seeds that are extremely difficult to get the germination to happen. And warm water is recommended. And so nasturtiums, for instance, are a seed that benefits from soaking in warm water. I wouldn't necessarily use boiling water on seeds because there is that potential, particularly with small seeds, that you could kill that little bit of life that's inside the seeds. So I would caution against using boiling water on seeds. Even if you're trying to kill some type of fungus or bacteria, if the temperature is above 160 degrees, that's hot enough to kill just about any fungus or bacteria that you're going to find in your garden or your home. So using water that might be 160 to 180 degrees can be quite effective at sterilizing the problems that might be impacting those seeds. But I wouldn't use boiling water. Claudia Alexander says, growing beets is a problem for me. What would you suggest for peas, pinto beans, lima beans, green beans? Heat. That is usually the biggest problem. All of those beans require a soil temperature that's warm, at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit, before they find a happy spot. So if you're trying to put your seeds outside before it's warm enough in the soil, the plant is going to suffer. They also require a lot of nitrogen. So if you've got a soil that doesn't have a lot of compost in it, or maybe soil that you haven't amended over a period of time, the nitrogen levels in that soil are probably pretty low. That's going to impact how your beans grow. Sun is a critical factor. All of them require a lot of sun. So make sure that you're growing them in an area that gets as much sun as you can possibly give them. The more, the better. So warm soil, a soil with nitrogen, and a very sunny area should give you a little bit better results with the seeds. Let's hope, with the beans in particular. Let's hope that happens. If any of those are lacking, do what you can to fix it. And a higher nitrogen fertilizer might be a good place to start. One area that could work is with legumes, for them to develop the little oxygen nodules on their roots. And that's what makes legumes particularly special in the garden, is that they can generate their own oxygen or their own nitrogen on their roots that they get from the air. Well, for that to happen, there actually needs to be a very specific type of bacteria in the soil working with the roots for those nodules to develop. And so that could be another problem with your beans in a low nitrogen environment, is that they're creating the nitrogen they need to grow, but the bacteria might not be present to really encourage that. So there's lots of sources out there that will sell you the inoculant that you can add to your soil that might be suitable for the beans. And so if you buy your beans at a nursery or if you buy them online, you might be able to get an inoculant that matches that seed perfectly. Okay, so let's go on to see what else we have. From Vladen, I discovered your channel a couple days ago, viewed most of your videos, want to be a gardener? Cheers from Serbia. You're already a gardener. By just trying to learn more about gardening, that makes you a gardener. I really like to tell people that I'm a gardener because I think it's a philosophy of life. Gardeners watch videos, and it doesn't matter where you're from, you like to learn what gardening is and how you can be better at it. Well, that's my philosophy in life. And I know that some of you have mentioned that in comments before, that you agree with that philosophy. Approach life by trying to learn more and just always try to do it better. So if you're a brand new newbie and you don't think that you know anything about gardening, but you're trying, well, you're a gardener just by trying. It's the successes along the way that are badges that we can brag about. But by just doing it, you're a gardener. So good for you. Jagannath, why brinjal normally attract more insects? What should be done to protect them naturally? I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but if it's about bringing in insects to the garden, I've got some videos coming up about pollinators and beneficial insects, regardless of what the problem is in your garden. If it's insect related, there's a very high probability that there is a natural control for that insect. And the natural control is usually another insect. And so it starts by identifying what the insects are and what's causing the problems in your garden, or identifying what pollinators are in your area. And then you work to attract them to your garden. Once you know what the insect is and what brings it, or if you know what brings the predator, you can start growing those plants. One of the best things that you can grow in your garden is dill or fennel. Not only is it great to use in the kitchen, but that umbral, the top of the plant that has all those flowers that's shaped like a little umbrella, it attracts so many beneficial insects that it's hard to keep track. So if you were to just add one plant to your garden this year to attract the good insects, I would say dill or fennel. And then you can start looking at the many other flowers that attract insects. And then give them places to live. There are many beneficial insects that will overwinter in your garden in grass, like tall landscape grasses. So if you grow some of those, you're benefiting your garden. So I'll talk a lot more of that, much more in detail in some videos that'll be coming soon. But the idea is to create a very biodiverse garden where you're welcoming the good insects because you're going to have the bad insects. And also encourage birds, particularly this time of year. About 90% of bird species get their primary nutrition for their young from insects. So the mother and the father bird are out hunting insects to bring back to the baby birds. So if you've got an insect problem, especially in spring, consider bird houses or bird feeders or something to attract birds to your garden. And once they're in your garden, they're probably going to snack on some of those insects that you don't want to have to deal with. Okay, I appreciate everybody offering all of the thank yous. Yes, Mom Seal says neem oil will kill the insects that eats the leaves. And that is something to consider when you're trying to control your insects, is that neem oil on the leaves after you spray it, if an insect eats those leaves, it can ingest the neem oil. Excuse me. So it's more than just spraying the neem oil, because the neem oil will kill the insects eventually, but by ingesting the neem oil, they can also kill the insects. Jesse Greenhouse says basil and parsley as well. Absolutely. Almost all herbs not only are great for their culinary purposes, but almost all herbs are ideal for the insects that are in your garden, for attracting the beneficial insects, for offering up the pollination opportunities for bees and other pollinators. So basil, parsley, dill, fennel, grow all of that and allow it to flower. And you'll definitely increase the biodiversity within your garden. Those are wonderful things. Lori Mayen says you're interested in companion planting and hope to learn more. I've got a video coming up very soon on companion planting. And my philosophy is a little bit different. I'll kind of give you a teaser right now. There's a book out there, I think it's Tomatoes Love Carrots, something similar to that. I actually have the book, and I'll be referencing that in my video. If you look at that book that talks about companion planting, it's got a lot of great ideas. But then if you look at another book on companion planting and compare them, do a comparison of the companion planting books, you'll see that the suggestions are completely different. And where one book will say definitely plant A with plant B, the other book will say, oh, never plant A with plant B. So my philosophy gets more into learning about the plants, because companion planting works best when the plants that are growing close together are growing in conditions that they both will benefit from. So you look at the watering needs for the plants and you match the plants and they become companions. And you look at the sun and light requirements and you look at the nutrient requirements. And now you start putting plants that will grow well together, and you should have improvement from both. And I think that's one reason why some of these sources say, oh, wow, these two plants are great as companion plants. I think it may just be that both of them like the area that they're growing in, so they're growing great together. Then you have the other part of the equation, which is how the plants influence each other, particularly when it comes to pests. And there are some plants that I think do work well together. in my earlier video, I did it almost 2 years ago now, where I show my tomato trellis and I identify that I've got nasturtium growing with my tomatoes. And I like to use nasturtiums as a plant that's a sacrificial plant because aphids will eat the nasturtium before they'll eat tomatoes. So there are many plants like that you can use as a canary in the coal mine, where it will show damage to plants before others. In France, for instance, and in some vineyards in California, they plant a rose bush at the end of like every fifth row because fungal diseases will impact a rose bush before it impacts the grapevines. Those are the kind of companion plantings that I think really work best and that we should spend our time trying to develop within our garden. Not necessarily does basil make tomatoes grow better. Well, they have similar water and light needs. So if you plant basil near tomato, both the basil and the tomatoes are going to grow well. But I've tried researching this and there's no definitive research that says basil helps tomatoes. So there's a lot more about companion planting. Look for that video coming up here in just a little bit. That's it. Carrots love tomatoes. Thank you, Varian. That's the book I've got, and that's the book I'll be referencing. And I'll bring some stuff from that book that I think works, but I'll also point out some things from that book that I don't think necessarily works so well. Yes, thanks, Vario. You're reading it right now. So read it with that concept in mind. Don't just automatically trust everything that's in that book as a definitive source. Take it for potentially good information, and then maybe question for yourself why that particular relationship works. And you may be able to figure out things that they don't mention in that book. And it's because of the sun and the water and the other similar requirements. So El Kabong asked, do I ever use compost tea in the garden? And the simple answer is no. And that probably shocks you. Compost tea, if you read the research on it, and this will also be in the same video where I talk about the pine needles and their supposed acidity. So compost tea is loaded with bacterial action, and it does have some nutrients. But think about what you're doing. You're taking compost that has nutrients and that has bacteria, and you're essentially watering it down. And now you're adding that watered down mix of bacteria and nutrients to your soil or to your plants as a full year feed. Why not just add the compost directly to your bed? And now every time it rains and every time you water, you're essentially creating compost tea. And so one or two or half a dozen applications of compost tea might add a watered down bit of nutrition to your soil. But if you've got the compost in your soil, and I use rough compost as a mulch a lot, create your own compost tea every single time you water and every single time it rains. And I think you'll notice an improvement with your plants because you're taking the benefits that are touted for compost tea and just making it a continual opportunity for your plants. Okay, so we're at the time that I wanted to go ahead and end this, and I could keep talking 4 hours, as you might guess, because I love doing this, and I love that you all get so much from these videos. But I've got to stop at some point. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here at the 1.5 hour point. I'll put some links at the end of this video for the replay. So if you're new, if you just discovered GardenerScott in this live chat, or if you want more information as new videos come out, in the replay, I'll go ahead and put some links to my latest videos so you can see what's happening on the GardenerScott channel every week. And so I encourage you to click on those links. For those of you that are subscribers and that are watching regularly, I want to thank you. I'm getting very close to 50,000 subscribers, which is just incredible. At this point, I think I'm going to hit that in about 2 weeks, and I'll definitely tell you about it. I'll be back next Monday at the same time. I'd like to hear your stories. I'll share with you a little bit about my weekend. I'll share with you my plans for the week ahead, and I look forward to hearing from you about how this next week works for you. And if anything you learned from today, you were able to put into practice in this next week. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to my other screen and end it now. Thank you so much to everybody that participated, everybody that had a role in making this wonderful as a first opportunity. And I look forward to many, many more.